Hello everyone. My name is Dr. Lisa Christine Girard, and today I'm going to be discussing some recent work that I did with my colleagues back when I was working in Paris using the MILLENNIUM cohort study. And so this study examined the associations between early language and prosocial behavior across a 2-year period from 3 to 5 years of age. Not good with technology, clearly. So the idea that language ability and social behaviors are associated throughout development is not a new idea. For example, studies have found associations from poor language to behavior problems, where children with delayed or impaired language may lack the ability to express themselves through verbal outlets, resulting in elevated frustration and consequently problematic behavior as an alternative form of communication. Conversely, the inverse association has also been found, whereby higher engagement and externalizing behaviors has been associated with poorer language development. And in the early years, it's been argued that this results from a reduced language-rich environment, as parents are focusing on reducing the negative behaviors at the potential expense of the children's language. So this association between language and externalizing behaviors has been a focus for a majority of research, but there's been little attention that's actually been paid to the potential associations with positive behaviors such as prosocial behaviors, which brings us to today's topic. Okay, so before I continue, I would just like to to highlight that I'll be focusing on expressive language in particular, because language, as you're aware, is very large and encompasses many processes that may have differential impacts on behavior and on prosocial behaviors in particular. So we'll start with defining both constructs. How do we define expressive language? Expressive language can be defined as the ability to label concepts, actions, emotions, objects. It's the ability to express thoughts, wants, needs, and desires, and it's also the ability to engage in successful linguistic dialogue and exchanges with others. Prosocial behaviors can be defined as behaviors that are empathetic, they're self-sacrificing, aim to help someone. So some examples could include sharing with others, being helpful when someone is hurt or upset, acts of kindness, or acts that facilitate inclusive environments. Okay, so how or why might expressive language and engagement in prosocial behaviors be associated? Well, if we look at the definition of prosocial behaviors, we see that oftentimes they're linguistically rooted. So theoretically, better language ability may facilitate prosocial behaviors through increased conversation and social interaction opportunities. So that is, increased interactions allow for opportunities to better understand the perspectives of others, to create meaningful exchanges, to express one's own needs, and consequently may increase the desire to engage in helpful and caring behaviors towards others. Alternatively, it is also possible that the association between language and prosocial behavior works in the other direction, so that would be higher prosociality to increase language, and for related reasons. So that is, children who are more socially competent and engage in more frequent prosocial behaviors may be more liked and therefore may interact more frequently, and this creates additional opportunities to develop their language. So this is because language learning is partially supported by the social environment, so interactions with parents, teachers, peers, and thus more frequent social interactions would provide additional context for language learning opportunities and potential increases in vocabulary. From the available studies, there's 3 patterns of findings, and the first is that of language difficulties to less frequent engagement in prosocial behaviors. And this work is typically done in clinical samples, so children with specific language impairment. Now, the second trend that we observe is that of language competence to increase prosocial behaviors, and this research is more commonly focused on samples of children using a general pediatric population such as the current study. Now, it's important to note that while patterns may seem intuitively similar, they are not, in fact, because the absence of a behavior doesn't infer its presence. Finally, there are also a number of studies, typically using population-based samples, that find no direct association between language and prosocial behaviors, but instead find indirect associations through mediating paths. So as mentioned, there's less work that's focused specifically on prosocial behaviors in language, and there's a lack of consensus in the literature. So for example, there's 2 recent studies, Ray and colleagues, who found statistically significant associations between children's language ability at 14 months and prosocial behaviors at 36 months, whereas Barnett and colleagues did not find direct associations between 12 and 36 months. So these are very similar developmental periods. Now, both studies examined children's expressive and receptive language. However, Ree and colleagues combined expressive and receptive language to yield an overall score, whereas Barnett and colleagues ran 2 separate models, so looking at expressive and receptive separately. Barnett and all did find a transactional model that was mediated through parent-child relationships. So sensitive parenting predicted both language and prosocial behavior, and in turn, children who were more prosocial and had better language were found to have parents that were more sensitive to their needs. So to sum up, there are 3 key issues that need to be addressed, which are the language processes implicated, also the onset of the potential association, and potential mediating variables. So this brings us to the objectives of the current study, which was to examine the associational paths between children's expressive language ability and prosocial behaviors from 3 to 5 years of age. And additionally, we wanted to examine these associations over and above the contribution of potential factors that have previously been implicated in both the emergence of language and prosocial behaviors, such as children's nonverbal cognition, their sex, parenting, so positive and harsh parenting, and then maternal depression. So the current study uses data from the Millennium Cohort study, which is one of the largest population-based developmental cohort studies that was comprised of over 18,000 families and their children residing in the UK, so England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, with infants that were born between 2000 and 2002. So stratification procedures were put into place to ensure good representation of the overall population. In the first wave, there was, like I had mentioned, over 18,000 children and family, and our study used 14,004 because of missing data. Okay, so here is just a table of the demographic characteristics for the entire Millennium Cohort study as compared to the 14,004 that were included in the current work. And you can see that those that were included in the current study were slightly more advantaged. And this is kind of typical of longitudinal studies whereby families from a more disadvantaged background tend to drop out at slightly higher rates. However, because of the differences that we found, we ran sensitivity analysis using imputation methods, and our model results were very similar, suggesting that attrition didn't actually affect our outcomes. So the measures that we used included the Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire for prosocial behavior, the British Ability Scale for expressive language, the Bracken School Readiness for nonverbal IQ, the Rutter-Malaise Inventory for maternal depression, the Conflict Tactics Scale for harsh parenting, and the Home Infant Toddler version for positive parenting. Okay, in terms of our statistical approach, we made use of cross-leg models, which, unlike multiple regression, don't impose directions of association. So we looked at 3 paths, namely the autoregressive, so that would be, for example, from language at 3 years to language at 5 years. We looked at concurrent, which would be, for example, the association, so bidirectional between language and prosocial at 3 years. And then finally, the cross-legged, which was what we were most interested in, so that would be, for example, language at 3 to prosocial behavior at 5. We present standardized betas as an effect size. And then also, just because we had such a large sample, our alpha, we used less than 0.001 as opposed to 0.05. Okay, so our hypothesis. Well, we hypothesized that we would identify a stronger association in the direction of better expressive language at 3 years to increase prosocial behaviors at 5 years. However, because the social environment exerts an influential role in the acquisition of language in early development, we didn't rule out the possibility of finding a smaller association from prosocial behavior at 3 to better expressive language at 5. And we did predict that these associations would hold once covariates were added into the model. Okay, so this is our, okay, it's presenting funny here. Sorry about that. Anyways, this is our first model, and as you can see, the model fit indices were good. So we see that we have significant auto-regressive associations for both language and prosocial behavior from 3 to 5, suggesting stability across this 2-year developmental period. We also have a significant concurrent path between language and prosocial at 3 years old. And then we have a significant cross-leg path from better language ability at 3 to increased prosocial behaviors at 5. We didn't find any statistically significant cross-legged effects in the other direction. And here is our model when the covariates were added. So the model fit did get slightly worse, however, it was still good. And as you can see, all the paths remain statistically significant with very similar effect sizes, even after we added our covariates. Although the associations are quite modest, so it's important to keep that in mind. We didn't build a mediation model because we only had two waves of data, and the mediation would require at least 3. So we just controlled for direct effects, and you can see that our covariates had direct effects in terms of prosocial behaviors, less so for language, but cognition was associated with language. Okay, so overall our results using a very large population sample both support and enhance the current literature. So in terms of support, our results are in line with the studies that have in fact found positive association between language and prosocial behavior in the early years of development. In terms of enhancing the literature, given the large majority of studies use cross-sectional data, our design adds by showing that there is an association longitudinally. Also, our results are in the context of a general pediatric population rather than a specific speech and language impaired population. So we can generalize our results to the larger population, which is nice. So just I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with cross-leg models, but I just wanted to point out briefly that the autoregressive paths are in fact very important because they tell us how stable the construct is over time. And this is particularly important in terms of developmental models where we would expect to see change. So for example, language at 3 years to language at 5, there's going to be growth there. So relatedly, the inclusion of the autoregressive paths in the overall model also controls for the previous variants at the first time, so at age 3. And this ensures that any significant associations that we find in terms of cross-leg paths aren't just a result of the correlation at time 1 between the 2 variables. Also, the sizable estimates of effect, so the standardized beta of 0.43 and 0.58 in our second model are important as they suggest that there is congruency in terms of prosocial behavior and language across the 2-year period. Okay, so we only found one cross-leg path, so from better expressive language at 3 years to increased prosocial at 5 years in this held after covariates were introduced. And this would suggest that early expressive language increases the likelihood for future engagement in prosocial behavior across this 2-year period, although the effect is very modest. However, we didn't find any support for the impact of more frequent early engagement in prosocial behaviors to better language across time. In terms of practical implications, so prosocial behaviors are a measure of children's social competence, and social competence has been found to be associated with children's long-term success within the classroom environment, both academically and socially. So the acquisition of language skills should be a focus in the early years, especially for young children who appear to lack social skills, as improved language may help children develop social competency abilities during interactions with their peers. In terms of limitations of the current work, so the data that we use relied strictly on the SDQ for prosocial behaviors. And prosocial behaviors, you have to make inferences because A lot of times it's not clear whether the child's intention was actually that of trying to be positive and helpful, but we do feel confident in that parents, given their intuitive knowledge of their children, should be good informants. Also, the consistency of the prosocial scale, the internal reliability. So in our cohort, we had on the lower end of acceptable 0.66 and 0.68 at age 3 and 5. So that is a limitation. However, what that means is basically that any pass that we found will be underestimated. So even though it is a limitation, it's better to be understated than overstating the association. Also, we only had data on expressive vocabulary in the Millennium cohort study, so we weren't able to do another model with receptive language to see how that may be implicated in prosocial behavior. Also, we only had 2 waves, so we could only control for direct effects of our covariates. We couldn't actually run a mediation model. In terms of closing remarks, so early childhood development is a dynamic process shaped by many factors, including within-child factors and the caregiving environment. And our results point to the importance of the interrelations between language and social development, and programming efforts that are tailored towards enhancing positive growth within the toddler years are more likely to be effective if they target all dimensions of development holistically. And finally, children's ability to effectively express their emotion and their needs with others may help in building better social relationships over time, and support must be given to the caregiving environment, which can be either a positive or negative model for the child, both in terms of language and social skills. And so then in terms of intervention, if there were any, or just programming efforts in general, the focus should aim at teaching parents skills required to foster language while also modeling positive social behavior. Thank you very much for your time. Questions? Yes.
I am from University of Bucharest. I'm an associate professor. So you have mentioned Vygotsky theory in your presentation.
Yes.
Okay. How your finding is related to the proximal area of development to the child is particular in a language area.
Mm-hmm.
Second question, which language impairment you are referring to? Third question, your research is based on English language, which is a Germanic language, because if you are talking about Latin language, it's a different state of mind. So.
Yes. Okay, thank you for your comments and questions. Okay, so in terms of Vygotsky's theory, that was used in terms of explaining why there would be potential associations between the two social learning theories. So parents become a model, teachers are models, even peers are models. That's why I had mentioned that language is supported, by the social environment as well, in addition to direct learning. The second question, what was your second question? That was to point out where research has been done. This is using the Millennium cohort study. This is with typically developing children. So we don't look at language impaired children at all. That was just the context of, in terms of trends, what has been found looking at this specific association. And when we're looking in the language impaired literature, typically it's from language impairment to a reduction in prosocial behaviors. That was just context, though. Okay.
We also could take questions for any of the speakers.
I just noticed in your presentation in the end you had, I don't remember the exact code now, but you had somewhere that it states, you hope now the scientists in the future will have a connection between mind and matter, mind and matter. But,
I was not planning to be that ambitious in saying that I have found a connection. What I was hoping is that perhaps this could be a pointer.
no, I was just gonna say that if you are familiar with the theories of Carl Jung about this kind of connections, because they have
Yes,
been,
but
yeah.
like I said, that is a psychodynamic approach, and when I mentioned earlier, there are different perspectives of dealing with self and consciousness. What I was talking about was strictly from the neuroscience point of view, very material point of view, if you want. A very limited approach is what I was talking about. So if we talk about Jung or we start talking about psychoanalysis, I think the whole, everything gets confused when too many perspectives are brought into it. This particular talk was entirely from the neuroscience approach, whether we could figure out how the brain as a working dynamic structure creates something called consciousness, or creates an effect or a feeling of being me. That is what I was trying to look at.